So, as I said right from the beginning, welcome back. For those of you who are very new to this, just go back and look at the previous couple. I think so far I've kind of just done a little bit of an intro, a little bit of understanding of what ACT is. Last week I know was much more about kind of the thoughts, how our thinking processes work, the concept of things like thinking traps. This week, which I've titled Ouch, Right in the Feels, we are going to be talking, I'm going to be talking, it's weird, I'm going to be talking a little bit more just about how emotions kind of fit into ACT. So initially, a little bit of information about emotions, kind of how we consider them, and a couple of bits and pieces, tips, things in there, and then a little bit about how ACT kind of considers emotions and how we want those to fit into that sense of anxiety and where it kind of fits, I suppose. I suppose to preface a little bit, because as I say it, it kind of feels like, oh, but anxiety, isn't it an emotion? Isn't it the whole kind of thing? And yes and no. I suppose anxiety, we want to consider the fact that anxiety is not just emotional. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But anxiety is kind of, it's an overriding sense of thoughts and emotions and some kind of physiological, kind of physical reaction stuff that goes in there as well. So when we talk about anxiety, people can talk about feeling anxious, and that is absolutely an emotion, that is absolutely kind of, that's appropriate and it fits. But when we're talking about anxiety, the kind of position of it, the existence of this thing, it's more than just one part. It's more than just a single emotion. It's more than just a single component of our experience. It's thoughts, it's feelings, it's physiology, it's predictions. It is a lot of stuff that kind of goes into it. So the first thing that we want to kind of be aware of, for want of a better term, when we are talking about emotions, is to understand the difference in, not even the difference, the anomaly of the idea of good and bad. So I will kind of set this up to start with, because it's a stance on life that I try and take. And it's something that absolutely applies to emotions, and it absolutely fits into the process of ACT and emotions and anxiety, and it equally applies to kind of thoughts as well. And that is this idea of good, bad, right and wrong. The issue I have with good, bad, right, wrong, they're all absolutes. Now, to give you some context here, I believe there are 6 what they call universal emotions. And the idea of the universal emotions they are emotions that, regardless of culture, regardless of language, regardless of social systems or access to anything, are recognized throughout the world purely based on look. And the 6 are, and I've written them down because I always forget them, I always forget one at least: fear, anger, happiness, sadness, disgust, and shock. Now, when we consider these emotions, my sense is there's an automatic part of your brain, part of your head that kind of goes, oh, that's a good emotion, or that's a bad emotion. And then there'll be ones in the middle. So for example, sadness. Most people will say, yep, that's a bad emotion. That's bad, we don't want that one. Happiness, oh, that's a good emotion. Yes, we want happiness. Fear and anger, a little bit more complicated, but I think a vast majority of people would say, no, they're bad. No, we don't want fear. We don't want anger. They're bad emotions. And disgust and shock, complicated, but on the other side, in that people are like, I don't know, do I want disgust? Like, do I not want disgust? Is that good? Is that bad? I'm not really sure. When we talk about emotions, and we put them in this position of kind of good and bad, the difficulty is, as I said, good and bad give the indication, at least, of absolutes, black and white, either or. And the reality about emotions is they are not absolutes. Emotions are very, very much the messy, cloudy, amorphous, terrible and fantastic things that happen somewhere in the middle of all of that. I will get in a little bit. The ACT actually refers to clean and dirty emotions, but they're a very different kind of process to what I'm talking about. I suppose what I'm trying to identify when we talk about kind of emotions, we talk about the sense of good and bad. Once we start trying to identify if something is good, if this particular emotion is good or this particular emotion is bad, then we kind of get caught in partially a cognitive loop. And I think that is something that it's prevalent, at least in our society, which is emotions are seen as these unreasonable things. They're, I hesitate to use the word abnormal, but they're seen as things that we want to reduce. We don't want to have them around. Emotions make us illogical. They make us unreasonable. And I'd love to know where this came from. Like, I honestly have no idea how far back we go with this concept of emotions being this thing that needs to be managed out, that needs to be processed and got rid of, and where logic and reason became this all-powerful thing that needs to rule over everything. You know, one ring to rule them all, and that ring is thought. So honestly, I'm not really sure where this comes from, but I think that emotions are bad. Now, if you query that, if you question that with somebody, oh, emotions are bad, well, okay, is pride bad? Oh, no, pride's fine. People don't mean emotions, they mean uncomfortable emotions. And that gets a bit messy, because I have met people in the past who were uncomfortable with being happy, because happiness was something that was actually so infrequent for them, or happiness was something that had been had been followed by kind of negative experiences so often that happiness was almost a bad emotion. Happiness was something that was uncomfortable. And so I think that's what we that's when we're talking about emotions, that's kind of where I want to go into. So the thing about just a general understanding of emotions, and part of the sense that we need to kind of be able to accept or work with around emotions, is that they are there. I know, I'm talking radical ideas here. Emotions are there. Ooh. We all know this, right? But what I suppose when I talk about emotions are there, what I mean is emotions trigger other emotions. Emotions are almost involuntary. One of those words is right. When we talk about emotional memory, it's a very different thing. If I talk to you, if I asked you, what did you have for dinner Tuesday 2 weeks ago? You might be able to tell me. You might be one of these people who is so very clear in your mind. You're like, oh, last Tuesday, well, that would have been. There are people out there who will do that. I would argue that in itself is not unusual, but it's the one-off. A vast majority of people do not remember clearly or quickly cognitive memory. Because cognitive memory is logical and it's reasonable, and we make perfect sense of it then and there. I don't need to remember that. If I asked you not the first time. If I asked you to remember something when you were much younger, a feeling of pride, or a feeling, on another side of it, a feeling of embarrassment. My very real sense for a vast majority of people is, you're going to remember something like that. I can still remember at the age of 5 or 6 and experience, and I can still remember, not quite feel anymore, but very, very clearly remember the feeling of embarrassment. This is at like the age 6. I'm way older than that now. Emotional memory is much faster and much more visceral. It's much more intense. And that is because emotions are keyed into kind of our physiological sense. And I'll talk about that kind of very shortly as well. So we have this sense with emotional memory that it is there, it is visceral, it is intense, it is locked into us, for want of a better term. The thing about emotions when we start kind of leaning it towards act is that emotions are not controllable. Now you'll remember last week I spoke quite a lot about the sense of control and this idea of the human need to control our experience. Oh, you just need to control your anger. You just need to control what you're thinking. I don't know. Just as an aside, never in the history of calming down has somebody calmed down when told to calm down. Love that one, because it highlights the sense that our emotions are not controllable. Our emotions are not logical, and they're not supposed to be. Emotions, if we go back to those 6 core emotions, right, the last one I think that I mentioned, shock. Shock is not supposed to be logical. Shock is supposed to be your body being alerted to a possible threat outside of your conscious control. That's what it's designed to do. And so I think this sense of emotions being uncontrollable, as I said, I don't know when it started, but I very much feel that that's why society feels like we need to be so logical. Everything needs to be logical and so on and so forth. Because we have this overriding desire to control our environment, to control ourselves. And emotions are the pure epitome of not controlling. One of the things, and this ties a little bit when I kind of said the sense of that there are, the way I would phrase it is that there are no pure emotions. Now, I don't use pure in the terms of good, bad, right, wrong, pure and evil and all the rest of it. I talk pure as in 100%, nothing but that. And my argument around that is I don't believe that anybody is ever one single emotion and that's it. Now, this could very well be a hot take or a controversial decision or observation, I don't know. I maintain that all emotions are a mixture of themselves. So it's highly unlikely if something occurs, I'm not just going to feel happy. I'm likely to feel happy with a touch of loved and a little bit of proud. Or happy with a little bit of maybe anxious or concerned or fear attached in there as well. When I am feeling, look, fear is probably the closest to get to a pure emotion, because when something happens, there is a great deal of fear. Arguably though, there's going to be other bits in there. There's going to be fear with possibly some anger, or maybe some sadness or a bit of disgust. What I suppose that I want to highlight, if nothing else, is when you are thinking about emotions, don't think of emotions as this pure, clear, almost understandable and definable thing. Emotions are more like a melting pot of a whole heap of stuff. This will tie very much into when I talk about ACT as a process of how we manage emotions, what it is that we can do with emotions. Remember this melting pot idea, because that's an integral part when we start talking about ACT. One of the things, and why I say kind of emotions, they're these automatic things, right? And why I want to really highlight why I don't ever identify anything as good or bad is emotions are designed to deliver messages. That's what they are there for. For example, fear is designed to alert us to a threat. Pure and simple. Anger, that is designed to motivate us to fight. Interestingly, when I start talking about kind of physiology in a little second, fear and anger, very, very similar in terms of the body responses. And so the physiology of emotion, way more complicated than you might think, which totally ties into my sense that pure emotions don't exist. Other things in there, so happiness is designed as a functional thing to let us know that things are okay at the moment. Sadness is designed to allow us to grieve. Sadness is designed to allow us to understand that what is happening now, I'm not enjoying, I'm not okay with it, and I need to kind of process that, I need to let that happen. Disgust is literally, when it's in its purest form, was literally designed to help us avoid. You think about lemons. Classic example. If I suck on a lemon, some people love that. A lot of people will find that kind of, there's a very much kind of a reaction to that. When we go back far enough, lemons, actually they're an interesting case because I'm sure lemons, okay, my analogy may have gone slightly skew if on lemons. Let's pretend I didn't say that. Let's go instead with poisonous berries because that's way, way more clear cut. When you taste a poisonous berry, if you put a little poisonous berry in your mouth, chances are it's going to be really bitter. It's not going to be good. Oh, I said it. It's not going to be palatable. It's not going to be enjoyable. And certainly, you're not going to want to eat more. That's the function of disgust. Disgust was designed to help us avoid things that are actually harmful for us. So, on that, and when I talk a little bit about this, so emotions, they are physiological. Emotions are not physiological. Emotions are tied to physiological responses. So, I mentioned fear and anger being very, very similar in terms of the physiology. So when you experience fear and you experience anger, our body responds and jumps into the fight-flight. So I know we've spoken about the fight-flight in the past. If you've already heard this, just stop me. You can't stop me, you're on a camera. Sorry, if I have gone over this is obviously just a little bit of a recap then. My apologies if I have talked about it. So fight-flight, that's that whole survival mechanism. When we have an emotion that's attached to that, the emotion is kind of the way that we try to process the physiology of it. And so, for example, you get things like tension in your neck and shoulders. And the reason you get tension in the neck and shoulders is because the throat is the most vulnerable part in the body. Despite what anybody will tell you, it's the part where I've got to fight against gravity to get my hand up. It's the part that's got major arteries. It's the part that if you do something here, the rest of my body stops working. My throat is very much the most vulnerable part of my body. And so when I get tension in the neck and the shoulders, that's an attempt to protect my neck. So that's a physiological response. You don't think about that. You don't know what it is. But I can guarantee you, when you are stressed, and we've talked a little bit about stress, or I know I've talked a little bit about stress, could have been in something that wasn't this. Anyway, stress is kind of the long-term effect of fear, of anxiety, of that survival instinct. So stress is based on an emotion of fear. Fear is the thing that makes us try and protect ourselves. The sensation of butterflies in the stomach, that's always a fun one. Butterflies is literally the blood leaving your digestive system. That's the feeling of butterflies, because you don't need to be processing food when you're running away from the anger floof. Call back to one of my previous conversations. We don't need to be processing food. We need the mud blood. We need the blood in our muscles. We need them in the core muscle groups. And so there's this entire link then between the physiological response. And it's almost like when we try to make sense of the physiology, that's when we start labeling the emotion. Anger, fear. Depending on the circumstances, either of those is probably correct. And to be honest, both of them are probably correct. ACT talks about to further get away from the good and the bad and the right and the wrong. ACT talks about the concept of discomfort. Now, when it talks about discomfort, that is designed to not label in terms of absolute, but to identify in terms of I need to do something about this. So when I'm feeling discomfort, that is something that I want to be aware of. I don't necessarily need to do anything with it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when I feel discomfort, that tells me I want to do something about this. Something is happening that is creating this physiological and emotional response, and that is making me uncomfortable. Now, where this can get complicated, and I mentioned before the idea of clean and dirty emotions. Clean emotions, from an ACT perspective, they are the emotion itself. So if I'm feeling sadness, that's a clean emotion. If I'm feeling fear, clean emotion. If I'm feeling happy, if I'm just feeling the emotion, that is a clean emotion. When it becomes dirty, for want of a better term, that is the assessment or the judgment that I attach to the emotion, which triggers another emotion. So I think last week I spoke about the idea of, I think it was the thinking self versus the observing self. So this kind of combination of the thinking self being the judgments, the assessments, the constant kind of, the stream of consciousness, the ongoing. And the observing self being the kind of just step back and go, okay, I'm walking beside this, I'm with this experience. I don't have to assess it, I just have to be with it. The thinking self is very much what we talk about when we talk about the dirty emotions. I'm sure there's better terms than clean and dirty. There's a whole heap of social loading attached to it's a dirty emotion. Anyway, it's what we refer to, right? So the dirty emotions, as I said, these are the assessments, these are the judgments that we apply to the clean emotion. But those assessment and judgments almost always trigger a secondary emotion. And that second emotion is what we refer to as the dirty emotion. So to give you an example, let's say I have to go and do public speaking. I have to go and do a big seminar somewhere. Now, despite all appearances, and the fact that I am a loud, I'm not going to use any derogatory terms, I'm loud, I'm out there, you'd think that I'd be fine, but I'm not. Speaking in front of crowds, okay. Side tangent ever so slightly, not hugely, just ever so slightly. Public speaking, it's an interesting one, right? Because everybody talks about public speaking being, oh no, I don't like that. Even people who are fantastic at it are like, I don't enjoy it, I don't like it, but I've got these tricks, or I do this, and this is how it works. The thing about public speaking, it triggers for a lot of people a fear response. And the reason it triggers a fear response, imagine, if you will, that we are all herd animals, because we are. People will like to say, oh no, we're a pack. No, we're not a pack animal, we're a herd animal, right? One of the things about being a herd animal is there is safety as part of the herd. If I am outside of the herd, I am tomorrow's predator poop. For want of a better term, you'll know about this called the tall poppy syndrome. The difference with the tall poppy syndrome is if you try and get outside of the herd hacks you back down. Public speaking is kind of the opposite side of that. It's if I put myself out of the herd, I feel vulnerable. Now that is a word that will come up a lot, all of the time when we are talking about anxiety. Core component of all of that kind of stuff. I kind of feel like even if there's not one set yet, I'm going to do a whole thing on vulnerability. Because when we are talking about anxiety, that's like one of the big ticket items. So anyway, I digress. I'll go back to my tangent before I go back to the main point. Tangent bit. Public speaking. When I am out in front of people, when I am making myself separate from the herd, there's this little cave person part of me that has that fear base that says any predator can nyom on me, nyom, 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 and I'm done, and the rest of the herd is not going to break their safety to rescue me. Right? Public speaking, it's a really interesting one. Right, I'll come back onto the main point. Like there's a main point. I'll come back onto the tangent that I was on before I went on the tangent. Anyway, I have to go and do some public speaking. Sorry, coming back to this idea of the clean and the dirty emotions, right? Clean emotion, the emotion itself, dirty emotion, all the judgments, everything else triggers another emotion. Right, now we're all caught up. I have to go and do public speaking. So I feel anxious about that. I feel anxious about having to do public speaking. Then my head gets in the road. Then my head starts going, well, that's just pathetic. Like, you know these people, you know what you're talking about. What's wrong with you? Are you stupid? Like, God, it's such a weak thing to be thinking you can't speak in front of public. Pfft, get over yourself. Now, those thoughts then trigger a new emotion. And that new emotion, it could be anything between sadness, disgust myself, anger or frustration, more fear, although I would argue that's probably going to come after the anger, frustration, sadness. That secondary emotion, that disgust at myself, that anger at myself, that is the dirty emotion. That's the one that's not actually what I'm feeling. That's based on my assessments and my judgments of myself. The assessments and the judgments are based on societal views and all that other kind of stuff about emotions being good and bad. Hopefully I haven't completely muddied that. So we talk about this sense of the clean and the dirty emotions. And as a general rule of thumb, there is one word, and I don't know if I've spoken about this yet. If I haven't, be prepared. I'll talk about it a lot because I hate it that much. And that is the word should. Because should is the ultimate in judgment words. This could be a little exercise that you could do. Actually, we'll take a few seconds now for you to do this exercise. What I'd like you to do, think about the last week. Over that last week, I just want you to kind of take a few seconds. Think about how many times you have said the word should or shouldn't to yourself. I should have got up earlier. I shouldn't have watched that TV show so late last night. I should be able to talk to my kids. I shouldn't have to go and explain myself to this person. I should be able to just manage my anxiety. The word should and shouldn't is purely judgment. Because I should be able to manage my anxiety, but I can't, and that means there's something wrong with me. And straight away we're coming back to this right, wrong, good, bad, these absolutes, these either-ors. Should is the perfect example of judgments that do nothing to help us. I'm sure at some point in time I've probably talked about the sense of helpful versus unhelpful. When I hear the word should, and this is something that with all of my clients, anybody who's listening to this, who is a client of mine, is just when they're going, oh God, Mike, we get it, just stop. This is my spiel, right? This is my big thing about the word should. The thing about shoulds, they don't achieve anything. So rather than using the word shoulds, I should or I shouldn't be doing this or not doing this, what we need to come back to is a sense of helpful and unhelpful, and comfortable and uncomfortable. There is a third one as well. You know what? Probably fits here. Functional and dysfunctional. So for example, classic example, anxiety. Most people, if not 99.9% of people, if you ask about anxiety, they would say it's bad. I don't want it, it's bad. Instead, what I'd rather people were doing is thinking, my anxiety, is it helpful? At the moment, no. Is it comfortable? At the moment, certainly not. Is it functional? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Because I think a vast majority of the time when people experience emotions that they call bad, 90% of the time it's because they're uncomfortable. We talked about the sense that in ACT we talk about discomfort being the thing. No goods, no bads, discomfort. Something is uncomfortable, that doesn't mean it's bad. So for a vast majority of the time when people talk about anxiety, they will talk about the fact that it feels bad. What it means is it feels uncomfortable. The functional, dysfunctional bit, that's where we've got to play it a little more carefully. So my whole, whatever that was that went out there talking about public speaking, in that regard, anxiety is potentially functional. If knowing the speech is coming up, that makes me feel like I have to prep. It makes me feel like I've got to have my notes set. It makes me feel like I've got to kind of think about how I feel, and I've got to kind of relax my neck and shoulders, and I've got to remember to breathe. And if it leads me to doing something that helps, anxiety is absolutely functional in that situation. If it makes me turtle up and sit in the corner and don't make eye contact and try not to breathe, that's more dysfunctional. It feels really weird to say, but it's still not bad, because the anxiety is doing what it's supposed to do in that instance. It's trying to keep you safe. My argument around that, to bring that tangent back onto kind of the main tangent, would be the difficulty with public speaking, with that reaction of I'm going to turtle up, I'm just going to shut down completely. I don't feel like that's the actual anxiety. That's not the fear. That's the dirty emotion. I'm feeling the fear. It's what my head then does to the emotions. That's the bit. That's the bit that turns it into a completely dysfunctional response. I can't remember what tangent I'm on now, but we're going to come back, right? So shoulds. I think I was on the should tangent. That's a big tangent. Like seriously, I could do a whole thing just on the word should. Anyway, so what we want to be really careful with, to come back to the main tangent. Yes, everything is a tangent when I'm talking, sorry. Hashtag sorry, not sorry, I don't know. The thing about the clean and the dirty emotions is being aware of that. Understanding that feeling an emotion, that makes sense. That's fine, that's supposed to happen. It's potentially helpful, it's potentially functional, probably uncomfortable depending on what the emotion is. When it turns into the dirty emotions, when this gets in the road, when my head starts applying the judgments, and then all those other emotions come in, that's when it very much switches across to being unhelpful, uncomfortable, and probably dysfunctional. So, emotions and ACT. So, acceptance commitment therapy. ACT, how does that consider emotions? And the short version of that is, emotions are like clouds. Arguably they're like waves, but in this instance we'll talk about them as clouds. Because, again, stop me if I've already said this. Clouds will come, clouds will go, and I can no more hold on to a cloud or push away a cloud than I can hold on or push away an emotion. I tried to grab hold of a cloud, but I missed. Yes, it's a dad joke, but it's all right. I'm a dad. I can claim these things. Yeah, I know nobody's laughing at that, but I like to pretend that people are like cracking up. The thing about clouds, as I said, you can't stop them. You can't hold on to them. And ACT, in this regard, it doesn't differentiate between the helpful and the unhelpful, the comfortable and the uncomfortable emotions. The position here is, if happiness arrives, I can't hold on to happiness. Happiness will come and happiness will go. But in that, obviously, sadness will come and sadness will go. Fear will come and fear will go. It is a very across the board position. And ACT has a very different kind of view of happiness, and that is much more about what ACT doesn't want to do is to have people believe that they have to have happiness. I have to be happy, because that's when the dirty emotions come in. That's when the shoulds come in. I feel this, but I should be happy, but I'm not happy. Oh God, what's wrong with me? And so it kind of loops. So ACT holds all emotions to be clouds. They come and they go. They are not solid states. They are not a suit that I can get into. Emotions are physically felt. This is another key component of how ACT considers emotions. Emotions are not just this thing that's out here, it's something that we feel, something that we experience. The word feel kind of says it all, doesn't it? Like I could feel my arm, it's me, it's something that's there. And so they will explain emotions, and we need to consider emotions as physical or physiological as well as emotional. And this ties very much back into, like I mentioned before, right, the thinking self and the observing self. Where we want to be when we consider emotions is the observing self. And because this is getting into the idea of, so what do we do with emotions, right? I've just spent all this time talking about emotions and what they are and what they do and all the rest of it. So what do I do? Like, I don't want to just be this person who everything happens and I just feel everything. No, we can do something with it. However, to get to that idea, we need to remember that sense of the observing self. That's the part we want to hold on to. Because the observing self is the part that experiences it, notices it. That was a really bad word. Notices it, but doesn't own it or fuse with it. Now you'll remember from last week, fusion and diffusion. And that's going to tie very strongly into, so what do we do with this, right? But I want to hold that process. That's the thing that I want everybody to be holding when I start talking about this. So what do we do with this is, we want to be in the observing self. We want to be in a position where we are aware and we are noticing, but we are not locked into any one thing. So what do we do? How do we deal with emotions? When these clouds of emotion come in, what can I do that allows that cloud to leave, or that manages what I do while that cloud stays. There are three things that I advocate. The first one, it's everywhere. Everybody knows about it. Everybody talks about it. The reality is it's still helpful, and that is breathing. I know for a vast majority of you, I am now teaching you to suck eggs. The thing about breathing though, when I consider breathing as a strategy, it's not about the actual breathing. It's about all of the other stuff that's attached. And that will come down to two main components. All of the little bits break into two components that I talk about when I'm talking about breathing. The first one is it really highlights the noticing, the observing self. Because if I say to you, take 3 deep breaths, what will happen is your head will suddenly focus on the 3 breaths. Breathing is a natural process. Breathing is not something we think about until you do, until you bring your attention to it. Then you remember it. Then you think about it. Then you notice it. So this concept of take 3 deep breaths focuses our mind on the physical activity of breathing and highlights a lot of the other stuff. Because if I said to you now, right now, I want you to focus on your breathing. Don't change it. Don't even try and do, I'm going to do deep breathing, or just literally put all of your focus and notice your breathing. And just notice what you notice. That was a bad sentence. Be aware of what is going on with your breathing. One of the things that is likely, not guaranteed, but likely to happen is, as you focus on your breathing, you will suddenly become aware of a whole heap more of your physiology, of what's physically going on. Even as I'm talking about focusing on your breathing, I can feel everything. Now, I've done this for a very long time, so my head is almost kind of hypersensitive to when I ask you to do something that's like this. It goes, ooh, have you noticed the tension in your shoulders? Have you noticed that your neck's a bit sore? Have you noticed your back's a little bit sore? Have you noticed that there's pressure on your heels because you're standing? Like, it does that automatically. And that's not because I'm special. It's because I've done it a lot, and it's that simple. So in terms of managing emotions, the first part of the breathing is about noticing the breath and what that then branches out to in noticing more about yourself. It's that observing self in its purest form. When you tell the brain what to focus on, that's what it focuses on. It can't help but notice other stuff associated. The second thing that fits in terms of just the breathing is 2 key components. And again, anybody who's ever talked to me is going to like, oh God, here he goes again. Time and space. When the cloud arrives, you can't force it away. You can't hold on to it. So what do you need to do? You need to just allow it the time and the space to do what it's going to do and to head off on its merry way. There is no urgency. As a general rule of thumb, I will often say this. There is very little in life that is actually urgent. Anxiety desperately tries to convince you that everything is urgent. And part of that is going to be the emotional stuff that's going on. When we have a fear base, our body is going into fight and flight. Our body is telling us that this is urgent, that we need to deal with this now, that I need to get rid of this because this is not okay. Time and space. It's not easy. I'm not going to pretend that it's like, oh, well, now I know this. Oh, sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. That's not going to happen. But it is essential as the first step in doing anything is being able to take time and space to allow emotion to exist. I sometimes like to think about kind of the emotions and stuff as almost like a second person. If it's talking to you, you don't need to argue with it. You just need to look at it, smile and nod. And when it suddenly kind of feels like it's been heard, it tends to kind of get a bit quieter and go, that was a great conversation. Feels fantastic. Emotions are a little bit like that. We don't have to do anything with them. Generally. Sometimes, sure. Generally, we don't have to do anything with them. But we've got to give them time and space just to exist. The second part is the diffusion, right? So we mentioned last week the cognitive fusion and diffusion. Fusion being that sense of these are the rules, these are the things I have to live by, and diffusion being, well, literally it is what it is. It's just there. That's it. You'll hear, as I say, diffusion, it is what it is, ties very strongly into time and space. It's almost, for want of a better term, it's like the cognitive process that's attached to time and space. It helps us give it time and space by thinking, well, it is. That's it. It literally just is. Similar to the thoughts, I spoke about the idea of holding it lightly in your lap. Having that belief, not getting rid of the belief, not trying to push the belief away or replace it with something else, but just holding it lightly. Emotions are no different. Because we've talked about clean and the dirty emotions. The dirty emotion is when we hold on to something too tight. So when the clean emotion arrives, cool, there it is. Can't do anything about that. Ooh, feeling the sadness. It is what it is. Hold it lightly. And the third one is what I would almost refer to as the specific process of trying to get to that. And that is 2 sentences, one of which is a question. So this is, how do I get my head to try and do something with the emotions? And that is the 2 sentences. That's interesting. What's that about? What I hope that that's interesting, what's that about, highlights is all it's doing is providing time and space. If I make a judgment, if I make a decision on something that arrives, I'm in there. I'm right in it. I'm like, oh, this is happening. If I say to myself, okay, that's interesting. What's that about? Now, what you may notice, and something I'm very conscious of trying to do when I do this, you may notice there's a physical, behavioral shift in how I process those. This is the thing I need to be in. Hang on a second, that's interesting. What's that about? And that's the idea of those 2 sentences. That's interesting. What's that about? All we're trying to do with that is to create some space. I don't want to solve this problem. I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to be in it. What I want to be able to do is go, whoa, hang on. That's interesting. Where's that emotion coming from? What's that got to do with anything? You don't even need an answer. And look, your brain will probably look for an answer, right? You might find an answer. Fantastic. But you don't need an answer. All you need is the ability to diffuse, the ability to step out of what that emotion is. I tell a little kind of story or an analogy that the use of this specifically. Like, I'm very big on, as much as possible, I don't ever do as I say, not as I do, right? I try to live all of the concepts that I talk about. And I remember quite a while back, now I'm usually so relaxed, I'm horizontal, right? I don't do a lot of road rage, I don't kind of have that stuff going on generally. When I do, it's a very interesting experience for me to do exactly that. Oh, okay, that's interesting. What's that about? Because I can guarantee you, numpty in the urban assault vehicle, cutting me off on the bike, why potentially that well, actually no, on the bike it is usually about them, because when you're on a motorbike and somebody cuts you off, that's really dangerous. Let me go with the car. That's probably slightly less actually dangerous. So I'm in the car. Actually, I'll just go back to, sorry, bee, ooh, look, squirrel. I'll go back to my original kind of story that I use. So I was driving to work. I used to work up in the hills, had to leave quite early. If you know anything about the Kwinana Freeway, you'll know that that is like a parking lot most mornings. And this particular road that I used to go down to, you had to do a left turn onto the parking lot of Kwinana Freeway. And so there'd be a long line of traffic. And you always guarantee there's that person who sits in the right lane and goes all the way up and then goes, oh, now I'm going to indicate and try and cut in front of the 80 cars I've just passed because I don't feel like I have to wait for my turn. I might be just a little bit judgmental about that, but that's okay. So I'm behind this car and they do exactly what every now and then somebody does. They just stop with their indicator on and wait for somebody to let them in. Now this line's not moving, so they're just sitting there. So I'm stuck behind them for 20 or 30 seconds. Now, logically, 20 seconds, even 30 seconds, even a minute, that's not like it's going to completely bust my work life and have me fired for turning up late, right? I've still got like 50, 55 minutes to drive. 1 minute, not going to make a difference. However, when that person finally did move, I took off way faster than was necessary. Now, and this is the difference between the thinking self and the observing self. The thinking self around that emotion could very well have tried to justify it, kind of stuff, tying again into the clean and the dirty emotions too, right? However, what I was able to do at that point in time was go to the observing self and just kind of go, okay, that's interesting. What's that about? Now, I had 55 minutes to drive, so I had a lot of time to think about this. You don't need to. You don't need to think about it. If it gives you that moment of going, okay, all right, that's fine. Look, that happened. Move on now. Cool. That's all that's required. That's interesting. I wonder what's that about. You know what? It doesn't matter. It's over. Cool. Awesome. Fantastic. Exactly what we want. That's not how my brain works. I go looking for stuff, right? So 55 minutes later, I have come to the conclusion. And there's a whole range of things going on around. I left later than I wanted to leave. I have this whole thing about being on time, and when I am late, I'm always late. I'm that kind of person. But when I am late, then I feel bad about being late because I feel like I'm inconveniencing other people. There's a whole range of stuff that goes on in there, right? Like I said, do as I say, not as I do. I'm not going to pretend to come on here and go, oh no, everything's fine. I've got no, there's always stuff happening. So I had a lot of time to think about that. However, by the time I managed to kind of process all of that bits and pieces put together, I didn't feel that initial kind of frustration or anything else anymore. And that was because I didn't mesh with it. I didn't fuse with it. I didn't jump into it and have that kind of emotion. I was able to kind of go, okay, that's interesting. What's that about? Now, obviously that was kind of frustration, anger, a range of other things that might be going on there. Like I said, no pure emotions. There's usually a range of stuff. However, it applies equally to anxiety. Because when I feel something, it wants me to join with it. It wants me to fuse. It wants me to realize that it's so important and it's everything. That's not helpful. That's not going to create any function out of it. And it's unlikely to make me feel any more comfortable. So I need to be able to step back from it. And so a combination of these 3 steps that I recommend to people, that I suggest, these are the 3 things that all help me to be able to do that. Will it work? I'd like to think yes. I can't guarantee it. And this is, again, really important when we talk about this observing self versus thinking self, the clean emotions and the dirty emotions. If you try these and something doesn't quite work, okay, have another go at it. Tweak it slightly. Send us a message and kind of go, look, I tried that, it didn't work. What can I shift? How can I change that? Do not, please do not start judging yourself for it not working. Oh, well, I must have done it wrong. Or, oh God, what am I doing? Or, well, that I must be so bad that this didn't work. Please do not let that dirty emotion kick in and that thinking self take over. So the 3 things: breathe, take a breath, not for the actual breathing, but for what your brain then does about the breathing. Diffuse from it. Recognize that whatever the emotion's going on is not absolute. It's not true. It's not defining. It just is. It's there. And the third one is, when you feel that coming up, just go, whoa, hang on a second. Because that's interesting. It's not dangerous. It's not a threat. It's just interesting. What's that about? Try those 3 steps. I will highlight, I think there was an observation about kind of leaving comments during the live stream. While that would be awesome, I can't see those because my computer's all the way over there. So however, like I said, I'm hoping I said in the last stream as well, by all means, ask the questions. I will talk about them, and then if there are any questions on this week's live stream, next week I will answer those, and I will try and kind of expand on them a bit. So absolutely try this. Try breathing. Try diffusing from what's happening and going, whoa, that's interesting. I wonder what's that about. Try those things. Let me know how it goes. Let me know if it works, if it doesn't work, if it works a little bit. Let me know if there's a specific angle that you've taken on one of those that works for you. I feel like I've rabbited on quite enough this morning, so I will leave you with that. Have a great week.